Okay, hello. So the topic that won out in the last video for our discussion group through peeracademy.net was individualism versus collectivism, or perhaps more broadly, just the concept of the individual versus the collective. This applies in many ways. There is a kind of epistemological angle I'd like to look at. There's the metaphysics of individualities and collectives, and of course the pragmatics and politics of ought we to identify as collectivists in the sense that the unit of analysis fundamentally sociologically is the community, as opposed to liberal individualism. So I like this topic. It's the first one that I didn't actually generate myself. Somebody suggested this. I forget whom, but I like this one, and I would like to get into it a bit in this stream. And feel free to give your feedback on the topic, and I'll address what I can. So first, I want to look at Max Weber's concept of the formation of communities, because Max Weber was basically an authoritarian who viewed the center of a community as emanating from some charismatic individual who got his charisma through a constellation of ideas that resonated with trends that were going on in broader society. The archetypal case here is really Jesus. So he's looking at trends within Judaism. Perhaps you could look at the Essene community. He's looking at trends, perhaps not consciously, but in the mystery schools of the Near East at that time. There are definite similarities between early Christianity and Mithraism, for example. He taps into this kind of ideal nexus. It constellates in his mind into something with an essential potency. And this is what allows then him to acquire some kind of following. Weber, on the one hand, emphasizes the role of personal charisma in forming communities. On the other, he emphasizes the importance of these ideas, which the ideas are inherently collectivistic. Language is inherently collectivistic. The rest of the process is this charismatic individual found some kind of community, and a constellation of material interest becomes infused in the power structure. And so people come to depend on the charismatic leader, often for their livelihood. This is the way the apostolic church operated at first, this kind of explicit economic collectivism. After the charismatic individual has laid down some basic guidelines for the life of the community, these become codified in the behavior of those closest to him. And so others basically emulate the nomos, the law that he's laying down. And that kind of develops a peripheral power structure that, after the center individual departs, carries on. And it's basically an inheritance of the personal charisma of the founder that gives legitimacy to the power structure. And this would be the apostolic succession, and why people view that as significant in Christianity. But the apostles are not around forever, and this lineage of personal charisma becomes supplanted by the unwritten and written law. So the norms established initially by that charismatic individual, which are embodied in the lives of the apostles, those are codified in sayings, maxims, narratives, and at an inexplicit level in just this kind of unspoken code of conduct that a community lives by. And this carries on in the kind of legal phase of charismatic development. So there's obviously a blend of individualism and collectivism in this whole process. But yeah, there's definitely a prioritization of the role of the individual in forming these communities. You can take the kind of opposite direction of an ideal constellation fixated in an individual their personal charisma spreading. As a result of this, you can look at a constellation of material interests as the driving factor and see, like, as Durkheim explores. So I'm looking at like the founding sociologists here, their opinions on this. Durkheim looks at the division of labor as being essentially what binds early community together. Just the fact that exchange between specialists yields greater productivity overall, and so in the terms of evolutionary psychology and evolutionary anthropology, you would say that that kind of group formation is favored under group selection. So groups which specialize, divide their labor, and exchange their goods compete favorably against other groups which don't do this. So I think in the modern context, we have the internet embodying this kind of ideal dynamic, ideal constellation of interests with charismatic personalities popping up, but then never founding actual communities for the most part. And so they kind of rise to preeminence on the basis of their verbal IQ and the ideas that they're tapping into, whether they're giving appropriately timely memetics or whether they are stale, or these sorts of factors determine who rises and falls, along with personal charisma, but not in the kind of lived personal sense that our evolutionary conditioning would have it. So I think there is a disconnect here in the way that online charismatic personalities rise. And we see this expressed in the high instances of drama when there's a revelation of the true character of the charismatic individual and people basically reject him. He fades into irrelevance. We see this all the time. So that ideal aspect is embodied online, whereas in our everyday lives, it's all about a constellation of material interests. And that constellation of material interests is governed by power centers which have been established for hundreds of years, also involving bloodlines that perhaps have been involved for thousands. And in this competition, the weight of material interest is clearly superior. So the question of collectivism versus individualism today manifests as, do you live individualistically in the interest of your comfort in your economic life, in the world as it exists, or do you strive for some kind of higher collectivity? And that collectivity depends on this ideal nexus being forged, which provides some kind of superseding incentive structure over and against the material incentives of everyday society. But there are complexities here too, because it's not simply that being individualistic in your economic life will lead you to look after exclusively your comfort or your wealth. It may also be that you are far-sighted. You're using an ideal lens, some kind of network of ideas and predictions to anticipate the collapse of the system. So the material nexus, or the constellation of material interests, for those who are far-sighted, maybe high IQ, high information consumption individuals, see that there are certain problems in the material conditions that exist, that we might have mass job loss from AI, that we might have demographic transition leading to lower quality of life in terms of aesthetics, in terms of crime, in terms of all sorts of different factors. And so there is a kind of pragmatic drive towards collectivism equivalent to the kind of Durkheim specialization or division of labor force, where if people don't have any kind of overriding ideology, but simply are preppers or anticipate a collapse of the system or something like this, then there is an opportunity for people to kind of negotiate interests in this liberal individual way and look at how collectively we can cooperate to survive just the exigencies of competition in the modern economy and modern life. Now, please let me know if everything's good with the audio and everything. I didn't actually manage to check that. So I probably should have. But in any case, right, there is a kind of liberal negotiation of interests that could go on. Probably, has gone on in certain contexts, but I don't know if this has the potency to override the inertia of people just living their daily lives and being comfortable in their situation, because it requires this kind of ideal filter to anticipate any kind of structural realignment of modern society, right? We don't really believe in it. Even if we believe implicitly in the memes, we believe in the narratives that we hear, the evidence of the senses as a rule overrides other forms of evidence when it comes to our preferences. Now I'm questioning whether the health of the stream is actually good. I believe it may have frozen. Not sure. If somebody could give me some kind of notification about the health of the stream, that would be great. And I'll go ahead and just open up a parallel tab and check on that. So the stream is fine. Great. Okay. So yeah, this topic, that's kind of the mundane political element of it. They're overlapping and intersecting individual interest versus collective interest in order to serve your individual. Okay, great. So in order to serve your individual interests in light of some kind of collapse that you anticipate, not necessarily a catastrophic economic collapse, but demographic decline, people are becoming less intelligent due to the lack of selective pressures. Regardless, anticipating all of those factors requires an ideal lens. And so this kind of network of ideal factors still has to take place. And that involves a kind of collective epistemology, because people don't realize these things on their own as a rule, right? People aren't individual thinkers. They're not independent thinkers. They simply believe in a set of narratives based on what narratives are credible institutionally for most people. But if your trust in institutions is lessened and you start to look to alternative institutions, then you start to look to often these charismatic individuals, personalities online who push certain narratives, and then it's their clout, their prestige, which determines whether you believe them or not, along with other rhetorical factors, their quality of presentation, the evidence that they're putting forward, their kind of logos, pathos, ethos elements. And this is a collective process, right? You can conceptualize it as an individual, as I'm looking after my best interest, and that's why I want to be part of a collective to address some of these problems, whether that's a political party and you think you can collectivize at the nation level, like a national collectivism, or whether you don't believe this is possible and look to a minoritarian strategy, you're still relying on a collective epistemological framework and also implicitly collectivist normative frameworks, because we don't arrive at the notion of the good or even the beautiful in a vacuum. We're influenced by our peers, we're taught by our parents, and the memes that are prevalent in mainstream society often work their way into even political dissidents or people of an alternative kind of mindset. So there's really no pure individuality, clearly. But let's, I guess, shift for a moment to the kind of pure conception of what individuality would be, because my individuality as a consciousness involves the collectives that I'm a part of, right? It's really inseparable. Like, I wouldn't be exactly who I am as an individual without the experiences I had of my mother, let's say, or the memories that I have of my mother, or my father, or my brother, or sister, or, classmates. The collectives that I was a part of are part of my psychic constitution, and all of the language that I use, all the words that I use, basically all the beliefs that I have will have originated from that collective. But in terms of, that collective being represented by my brain, I mean, all of my experiences are happening within my consciousness. All of it is happening within an individuality. And so I guess what I'm saying is, in the truest sense, individuality embraces collectivity. So the kind of naive materialist take would be to say that individuals exist within collectives. And I guess I'm saying the opposite, or it's really a dual containment, where at the same time, individuals contain collectives. And I think psychologically speaking, this is how we actually operate. We have a multitude of subconscious factors which are competing for influence, and these subconscious factors are often modeled on the personalities that we encounter in everyday life. So we internalize our father, as Freud thought. We internalize the friends that have clout, and internalize and put in some kind of shadow complex the members of communities that have received unfavorable outcomes. So we don't want to be this given archetype, and sometimes that aversion to a given archetype, which is being internalized, motivates our conduct to a great degree. Some people, that doesn't need elaboration. I think the point is clear. So yes, we contain the collectives that we are part of. They also contain us in a materialistic sense. In my own system of philosophy, there are two timelines in parallel necessarily. There is the ideal timeline of the continuity of consciousness, and implicit in this logically is the continuity of physical structures. To get into the metaphysics of that would be complicated, so I won't. But what I'm saying is that according to the causal nexus, which is itself an ideal structure and is implicated by ideal time, the causal nexus gives rise to the community. And so we couldn't exist if that community didn't itself exist. But what I'm kind of getting at is that even there, it's not that the community has to exist to give rise to the individual in a causal sense. Causation is an a priori form of the mind, and mental time precedes physical time, according to me. And others would echo this view. But in other words, like, it's an aspect of ourselves that there is such a causal nexus that brings about the condition of our own possibility. If you understand my philosophy a little bit, you'll understand what I'm saying there, but that's really just an illusion. And I'll definitely clarify anything if people have questions, but and you can definitely ask in the group chat if you want about that element of things. And the group chat will be on Saturday at 10 a.m. in my Discord. The link to the Discord should be in the description after this is done, or maybe it's there already. I'm not quite sure. And ordinarily, I put a poll in the upper right-hand corner that you can click on to vote on the next week's topic. This time, I don't think I can add a poll after I've streamed it, and so I might just ask as I'm ending what of my list of topics people would like to discuss next. And this is through pureacademy.net, and if you haven't signed up for the site, please do check it out. We use it as a platform for these discussions, which are on various topics. And this is also a kind of collective formation that is kind of intentional, in that as a result of this kind of charismatic process, high potency figures like a Nick Fuentes or like a JF or like whoever is popular on YouTube right now, they have their shtick. They have their set of ideas that they've really clung on to that are aligned in their own mind. They have this ideal nexus, and this gives them a force in the community, and people receive this kind of coherence from them. We like cognitive consonance, not dissonance. And so when someone has a highly consonant worldview, this is appealing to us. even if often it's not actually the most honest perspective. The cheap way to achieve consonance is to pick a few axioms, especially like biblical inerrancy or something like that, and then just work from it. And you can kind of logically construct a consonant ideal framework without all that much effort in terms of developing an actual epistemological method. But anyway, as a rule in these communities, high valence individuals send out ideas. These ideas are received, and the interest, the material interest of the content producer is to grift, is to ask for money, is to get a bunch of money through donations, and then basically to leave. Whereas to really achieve something in terms of a long-term collective development, what you need is more along the lines of a Moses, where there's an ideal kingdom of God that comes down, reaches clarity in an individual, and this individual uses this clarity to create a breakaway from the slave system of Egypt, I guess, to lead us away from wage slavery in the modern context and devise some new form of community. That's not what happens. And it also doesn't happen at a kind of intermediate level, which I'm trying to do. And other people have done similar things as well. Develop explicit communication networks that facilitate not this kind of one-directional creator to consumer channel, but pathways of conversation between consumers of information, getting them to become producers in their own right to a greater degree. This is a process that I think has a few different roles. One is the priming that can occur. So if you get people discussing ideas and thinking critically about them, and you get interactions between creator and content consumer, then you get a more educated populace or audience, and that audience in the future will be receptive to those crystallized networks of ideas that are operating at a higher kind of intellectual level. And that is not necessarily just higher abstraction and higher like academic content, but also just more realistic and more tied into the empirical world and more grounded. And so by creating these explicit communication networks and, trying things like discussion groups, we can help to educate each other, because the hazard in simply going to content producers who are doing their own independent research and then kind of presenting the stuff to the masses, the hazard there is that people simply absorb this content as entertainment. They don't remember much of it. They often simply forget videos from like more than a couple weeks ago. They don't remember all the details because that's not how people learn, right? The content producer remembers a lot of the stuff because they had to exert effort in acquiring that information. If it's zero effort on your end and you just listen to something, you're not going to retain that, right? If we have to expend effort to achieve something, then we value it higher, right? So the discussion group, these sorts of experiments, peeracademy.net, this is a way of getting people to have some form of skin in the game. It's insufficient, though, ultimately, to form a long-term collective, because it's not real skin in the game, because there's no cost for exit. And that's ultimately what you need to have a constellation of material interest. You have to make it so that people have more to gain by being a part of the community, and therefore they'll have something to lose in material terms by exiting. But space-time, the blind Pharisee, I'd like to hear you talk more about time and causation. Right. So time I would view as a linguistic structure in ideal space. I would view each moment of perception as its own kind of fixed form. There's a combination of syntactic operators in any given moment, and that is intelligible in terms of a longer term sequence only with certain kinds of other moments. So suppose a superfluity of these sorts of self-contained moments of experience, an infinite number of these. Any one will be connected in a timeline with only certain other kinds of moments of experience, to create fourth dimensional or fifth dimensional timelines, dynamic systems. There's a certain kind of network of third and fourth dimensional time slices or statics that can fit together. And so causation appears to us a process of ontological development, when I would view it instead as a linguistic structure. So time is a narrative, is a story, and I've expressed this idea many times before: eternalism, temporal B theory. You're reading, and I know space-time, you're aware of this, but you are reading through the book that exists there all at once. It's not that chapter 1 begets chapter 2. It's that you happen to be reading chapter 1, and therefore chapter 2 must succeed chapter 1. And if you were in chapter 2, then chapter 1 would have to precede chapter 1. So this is the kind of temporal structure that I believe in. I think physicists believe in it too, as a rule. And so when I say that, like, your individual existence depends on a collective, that is in terms of the materialistic narrative of cause and effect. And it's not fully accurate, according to my philosophy, which is why I just have to kind of autistically insert that qualifier that I don't really believe in causation in an ontological sense. I believe causation is an ideal structure itself, and therefore part of the mind is the temporal entailments of a given moment of experience are a product of that mind and are, in a sense, contained in that mind. Again, an instance of kind of dual containment, where the individual moment exists within time from a certain perspective, but from another perspective, the implicit timeline of a given moment is a part of the identity or the notion in the Leibnizian sense of that moment. Ben D. You're a perennialist, right? If so, could you explain what is meant by perennialism, and are you aware of any Christian philosophers, theologians who hold to this view? I don't know of any other Christian perennialists, honestly. And philosophical perennialism, there's different senses of perennialism. Like Aldous Huxley would define it as a certain set of beliefs that are often held in concert, like reincarnation, like the idea that the core of the individual is actually universal, which again relates to this individual issue and is a deeper level of the metaphysical discussion of individuality. And that's kind of a not a dual containment, but a kind of triple containment. But I could get into that in a moment. Other kind of beliefs of perennialism, karma, the idea that through asceticism and renouncing desire, you can attain a greater knowledge of God. You see echoes of a lot of these views in Christianity, and I view Christianity as essentially a metaphorical, analogical description of the philosophical system of perennialism. Who knows when it first occurred to someone, this nexus of ideas, and what sort of justification they used, how they arrived at these notions. I have my own method of arriving at them, but a ton of people have held these sets of views for their own particular reasons. Torin McCabe. I like theories like the personality Big Five, since when you have to view through 3 or more angles, dichotomies like individual and collective, seems shallow. I'm not sure quite what you're getting at there. But yeah, the Big Five is an interesting notion. And yeah, it kind of points to this kind of archetypal nature of individuality, again, at the psychological level. I mentioned before how I think subconsciously, in terms of the personal subconscious, in Jung's sense, we build the subconscious as a result of experience. Those kind of, not quite conscious events which enter sense perception but are never really internalized in conscious awareness, those go into the subconscious. Aspects of personal relationships, value systems that again aren't fully conscious go into the subconscious and inform our decisions. So through that process we build up archetypes of particular others, but deeper than that, there are archetypal structures within the psyche that are just absolute to psychological beings, to minds most generally. I think that must be the case. and then also to human beings as a result of our shared evolutionary conditioning. And so the Big Five points to like those traits and those networks of traits which are favored under group selection or individual selection. And yes, we will find ourselves in these kind of archetypal positions, and those define who we are individually. Like the fact that you have someone, I prefer Myers-Briggs as a rule, just because I'm more familiar with it, and I've memorized the different like sets of attributes, whereas Big Five seems, I mean, I know it's like better attested empirically at this point, but if you are the INTJ like I am, you know what that is based on the role that it's meant to fill in a broader community, in a broader society. And so like my INTJ-ness wouldn't mean as much if there wasn't a society there for me to fulfill that role within. In addition to this, there's an evolutionary source of archetypal patterning of the subconscious. There's personal experience. There is, I think, metaphysical necessity, which just says that like there are certain kinds of psychological structures that are consistent. Like we have to basically view logic as a mind, or the principle of, you don't want self-contradiction, you don't want paradox in a system, or it won't be stable as a mind. It won't be able to perceive something. There has to be certain kind of logical archetypal structures to a mind in the first place. So those are three aspects. Another, which I speculate on and I don't have good evidence for, is the notion of Sheldrake's morphic resonance. So the idea that the fact that people of a given type behave in a given way according to stimuli might pattern the response of similar organisms in altogether different contexts. He points to different sorts of empirical evidence for this phenomenon. One would be the idea that pest control workers often have to change out the bait that they use for mice, because when in a given area you keep on using the same kind of bait, mice that have never been exposed to it start to react negatively to that kind of bait, which has been used to lead other mice to poison. A similar notion would be the 100th monkey effect, where you teach, a bunch of monkeys. I know the details of this experiment have been debunked, but there are other sorts of examples to look to. But the original experiment was this, in some Japanese island, they were experimenting on monkeys, and they trained them, teaching them how to do a certain thing, acquiring food with sticks, or something like that. And after they had taught like 100 different monkeys in nearby islands started picking up the same behavior. And based on my own anecdotal experience of things, crowd dynamics, I suspect that something like this is operative here. Sheldrake's notion that there's an actual kind of physical field that, forms have a kind of gravitational effect, where if a crystal forms in one given way, then it's more likely to then form that same way in another place. He points to like pretty specific biological phenomenon, like the protein folding, the way that protein folding seems to be much more efficient than it ought to be based on random just chemical chance, basically. So that's, it's an interesting notion. But Sheldrake views it as a kind of, force that's exerted through space, whereas I, again, would view it in this kind of linguistic sense, where there is a kind of karma operative, where if you embody a given archetype, others, especially of your same kind or type, will tend to embody it as well. And I've given the arguments for that before, but that would be straying a bit far from individual versus collective. But what that would imply, morphic resonance or something like it, is that psychologically we are really not individuals, even taking away our shared conditioning, our material contingencies, and also like the fact of language, shared conditioning, all these things. There would be a direct psychic connection between humans, between perhaps all different kinds of organisms. But the idea of morphic resonance is that similar structures affect one another more strongly than dissimilar structures. So, in other words, like myself as basically an Anglo-German Scandinavian person, my behavior would influence through morphic resonance people with that same kind of ancestry. Not that it wouldn't influence a sub-Saharan African, but it wouldn't be quite as strong. And then Darius the Great, can you explain your position on free will and agency a bit? There doesn't seem like much room for individual agency when operating under a B theory of time. Yes, that's true. And it's a complicated topic. So if you take the B theory of time and some kind of multiverse, including the many worlds, then there are multiple possible futures and pasts by implication, which are consistent in terms of this kind of linguistic structure with the present moment. And so it's not that you are necessarily consigned to a given future. It's that there's a range of possible futures, all of which themselves are inevitably experienced under B theory and a multiverse. But it's not as though you're on a linear path of like kind of Calvinistic determinism. It's at every moment, it is as it appears to be, that we have a range of options, a range of paths that we could go down. And this is, it's hard to explain this element of things, but ultimately the will to be who you are occurs outside of time. The will is transcendent to time and space. It's the ultimate substance of things. In itself, it's perfectly simple and unconstrained. It's essentially God as conceived in classical theism. And so that will, that is the essential being of being, the core of all things, that will expresses itself infinitely in all possible expressions of desire, which end up being the jivas to the Atman in perennialism. If you're not a perennialist or you don't know the background of these ideas, like I don't expect to convince anyone, and it takes a long time to explain any of this stuff. And historically speaking, like I'm just straight giving away like the core esoteric doctrines of all the mystery schools. So if you want to understand it better, you definitely feel free to ask me, join my Discord channel or Peer Academy, ask me whatever questions you want, because I know this stuff is confusing. But the answer to the question is the agency exists outside of time. It's God's agency. It's God's free will that manifests in you being who you are. And that is at the same time God's love for you. Jibdi. And of course, God would transcend individuality and collectivity. I think maybe that's why in the Bible, God is often referring to himself as a we, in addition to an I. Jibdi, do you believe in the resurrection of Christ? I believe in it. Sure, I don't have good evidence for that, but my suspicion is that Jesus was an incarnation of God, which is simply a human being who is not led by the jiva, but is led by the Atman and the truth and the Logos completely. And yeah, such a person in my worldview would have the powers that are attributed to Jesus. So everything described in the Bible I can believe in according to my philosophical system, but it's very far from the Orthodox theology or Christology. Torin McCabe, my point on Big Five versus dichotomy is that reducing variety of life to on-off is reductive, yet trying to paint with 5 or more colors is creative and uplifting. Okay. Well, I mean, I think you want to take a both-and position there and not simply go for heuristic schemes with more than a certain number of primitive elements. You want to have sometimes a dichotomy when that's appropriate. There are different levels of analysis, and this is all all of these words are simply to strengthen our understanding of society and human nature. And so if they serve that function for my purposes, that's sufficient. So I don't know. I like the idea of individual versus collective. There are a number of dimensions to examine there. Joe Howard, Sorry if you've talked about this elsewhere, but why do you believe in reincarnation? Seems absurd to me. I have a video on that. I'm tempted to repeat the argument because I like these arguments. I believe in these arguments. You can bait me easily into getting into all this stuff. But I do have a video on that scientific basis of reincarnation. Space-time, there would have to be some kind of evolutionary effects to Sheldrake's resonance, right? Yes. And so he gets into that in his books. I would refer to Sheldrake himself, who was a prominent biologist, botanist, really, who, I mean, his work is still featured in textbooks in plant biology and stuff like that, made important contributions to the field. And it's his intimate knowledge of microbiology that led him to this notion. The fact, like I mentioned before, protein folding, things like that. And I believe there's other thinkers out there who kind of have calculated, and I don't know anything about this literature, but I just have vaguely heard of it, who have calculated the kind of time that would be required under natural selection and the kind of mutation rates that we observe. And they come up with, evolution should not have proceeded this far, this fast. And so if you are of that camp, then morphic resonance would be of help in explaining our current position as an evolutionary system. Space-time. It could do some work to explaining jumps in biological forms that appear somewhat guided. Yeah, and that's the notion is the creode. That's the term that Sheldrake uses, that paths of development kind of forge channels that other similar organisms, similar forms end up following. Randy, what's your ethnic composition? I am British, Norwegian, and German. Common sense philosophy. What state are you planning on buying land in? Arkansas. For the laws. And Randy, Hafthor Bjornsson recently shoulder pressed a 284-pound dumbbell. Thoughts? Okay, great. That's very impressive. So, and then Jack Lintern, have you talked about eugenics? And that's another element of individualism versus collectivism. So the individual, according to evolutionary psychology, is motivated to maximize their genetic replication. That's under individual selection. But there are situations in which refraining from maximizing your individual reproduction will result in your community living longer. So in a context of intense group selection where there are multiple communities, collectives in competition, kind of sacrificing your own personal genetic outcome for group fitness overall might end up with the future being more full of your genes than it otherwise would be. So that's basically the whole story on eugenics as it applies to individualism versus collectivism, as far as I can tell. But there was also the issue of epistemological individualism versus collectivism, which I think is an interesting one because I've argued in the past for some elements of liberalism, like free speech, but I've argued for that on the basis of collective efficiency in a certain sense. So, in other words, the group will compete against other groups if it has a maximum flow of information. If it has those dialectical structures which facilitate the growth of knowledge for the organism as a whole. If you allow freedom of speech, you're going to get a lot of people saying things that are wrong. But if you reduce the cost, the risk of putting forward novel views, then you can accelerate the new ideas entering the system, the mutation rate of ideas, and there's probably an optimum where you don't want too much mutation ideologically, you don't want too much stagnation, and this is for the purpose of building a scientific model of the world that will then end the result will be the community will structure itself in ways that are favorable in group selection, and also in terms of building technologies. So that there's collective epistemology justifies prioritizing the individual and giving the individual rights and kind of treating the individual as sacred in a certain respect, because the individual is the source of change in the system. Because collectives, they don't have minds as far as we know. Like a group of people that work together, there's no collective consciousness in an explicit sense, in the sense that I have a center of my awareness. It's right here. I perceive distance based on this locus of perspective. The collective doesn't have that. The collective doesn't have an epistemology in an obvious way. It has a set of memes that operate in complementarity based on always the psychological structure of the individuals comprising the collective. And so memes filter through the system because they capitalize on individual incentives, because they're compatible with human psychology. Everything new in the system comes from individuals. The collective has to place a high value on individual contributions and the chance that any individual could come up with something significant in order to maximize group fitness. Because the community that suppresses the speech of somebody who, might seem like a heretic to the mainstream of that society, if they suppress that speech and it contained some critical detail that allowed a higher degree of fitness for the group, then that group will lose compared to a group that did not suppress that same, black swan individual ideal event. And there's also the idea of the reproduction of collectives. You need exceptional individuals to result in ideological fracture. So you have, let's go back to, probably most of you who are watching now weren't here when I said this stuff, but Max Weber's account of the formation of communities. So going to the example of Jesus operated in a Jewish ideological context with the mystery school elements in the background, like the Platonism of Philo, the esoterica of the Essenes and Mithraists and stuff like that, all blended together. It was a kind of milieu, multicultural milieu, especially around Nazareth, where he was born, which was near the Decapolis, or the name for the Greek cities in that region above the Dead Sea. So he has this context he's operating in. And so it says I can't connect to the chat. So I'm not actually sure if the stream is still good and healthy. And I can't check the chat to know. So I don't know what's going on there. Hopefully it's still working. Anyway, so he's operating in this context. Jesus comes up with this new crystallization. He fits the ideas, the kind of loose memes that are around, he fits them together in the perfect way, expresses them in the perfect way, and this creates an ideological fracture where his charisma draws apostles from the Jewish community. These apostles form habits. These habits lead to a constellation of material interests of a community that surround this whole network of charismatic personalities. Jesus goes away, goes to heaven, and the apostles become the center of community. A law is formed around them, which eventually mimics the structure of Judaism, a legalistic religion. And so effectively, Judaism reproduced. Just like a biological organism reproduced, Judaism reproduced. And then the same thing happened out of Christianity with Islam, not the first one. I mean, there are fractures within Christianity almost immediately. That's why Christianity is the largest religion in the world, because it's easily fractured. And I think there's something to that to admire and to appreciate. And if Catholic orthodoxy reigned from the very beginning, I don't think Christianity would have the potency that it does. But in any case, what I'm getting at in terms of group fitness is that groups should want to reproduce themselves, even if in the short term, this means that the power center of the group loses something in terms of its influence over all of the existing members, having multiple centers of power who are idealistically and genetically related will mean that in this kind of meta group struggle between like civilizations, class of civilizations, your civilization will have the edge. And so you want to give people freedom of speech because you want Jesus to be able to preach and fracture your community. You want that. You want that fracture. And I always encourage people who, I get close with, who maybe have absorbed some of the ideas that I espouse. I definitely encourage them to go their own way with it and explore their own kind of thought, right? That in a way increases my group fitness, or the group fitness of perennialism, traditionalism, all the things that I care about. So again, I'm not able to see the chat as it currently exists. It says I can't connect. If I don't know if I refresh this page, will it result in the stream going down? So I could find that out. But what if I open a copy of the same page? Okay. So now I'll close this one. And that fixed it. Okay. So, let's see. Darius the Great. So do you consider orthogenesis as a legitimate field under this system? Is there some kind of final state that you see evolution stopping at? I'm not familiar with the idea of orthogenesis. I know ortho is like agreement. So yeah, I'm not quite sure. And is there a final state for evolution? I doubt it. I think it can probably continue indefinitely. Although maybe you run into an upper limit in the time span of the whole universe together, where, under our current models, we expect it to continue expanding, entropy to increase, therefore it won't be hospitable for life. In a sense, that's an upper limit, but it may be that there are certain pathways of evolution which allow for a structuring of the end state of the universe that results in something other than entropic death. This is the theme of Isaac Asimov's short story, The Last Question. I definitely recommend that short story. So I think that kind of answers this whole issue. Ben D. Do you consider God to be personal as portrayed in the major world religions? If so, is prayer something that you do? What do you pray? I pray all the time. And I do view God as personal in that sense. He's also transpersonal. So I think there's a personal aspect to God. So, essentially, I think there's... Because, like I said before, there's essentially an infinite number of minds, meaning that there is a scale going to essentially infinity in terms of intelligence, which means I exist within not just one infinite mind, but an infinite series of infinite minds, and there's kind of one maximum in this series that knows me and yet has kind of differentiated consciousness like I have, and can therefore interfere in this system and cause miracles. And everything that traditional religious people believe about God, I believe that. I believe in that kind of, highest consciousness, highest mind, maximum mind. And so, yes, I pray for all sorts of things. I pray for strength, I pray for forgiveness, and I encourage people to pray. Ben D. Oh yeah, what do you think of Alan Watts? Wasn't he a perennialist too? I like Alan Watts. I've read one of his books. His book on Christianity would actually be a very good take for whoever it was that was asking about like Christian perennialists. That book was, because I was a perennialist before I reconverted to Christianity, and that book allowed me to really understand how I can understand the Christian myths and also historical reality in terms of my philosophical beliefs. Charles Macaulay, any new developments with your Atlantean hypothesis? It's basically in the same position as before. I still believe in it. I still think the elites that exist now, partly are demons, partly they're under the influence of trans-dimensional beings, most likely, like Alex Jones thinks, and I think that there's also this kind of bloodline, deep bloodline. It's probably primarily within Judaism, although not confined to Judaism, the deep bloodline of the early Neolithic elite. And that's where you can really start to historically trace it anyway. Um, so nothing really new there, but the center doesn't die off, especially when it continually fractures. I think the Atlantean bloodline fractured many, many times, but they always keep that kind of blood memory of where they're coming from, certain customs, and maybe some factions have actually retained the esoteric sciences of the last civilizational cycle. Um, so this, I suspect, would be stuff like quartz crystal levitation, acoustical engineering, stuff like that. What is your opinion about the very binary worldview of Western civilization? Good and evil, black and white, urban, rural, bad, good, left, right. There always has to be two radically opposing poles. Well, I mean, to be fair, this is not unique to Western Civ. It's, yin and yang in Taoism, Prakriti and Purusha in Hinduism. I'm pretty sure like virtue and vice is basically universal, urban and rural. Maybe there's more of a blend of having like an urbanity in rural environments in some other cultures. But then again, medieval Europe had a higher degree of urbanization that kind of preserved the aesthetics of the rural. The urban elite were often country gentlemen, which Western Civ isn't the only one of that. But so I reject this. It's unique to Western Civ. It's just kind of necessarily the structure of things that before any other degree of complexification, you go through a binary, because 3 involves 2, 4 involves 2. Anything higher involves the dyad, essentially. Space-time. Would you defend a distinction between religious and secular law and the institutionalization of secular law only? Or is that all a false dichotomy? It's tough. I would think probably the optimum strategy is to have, like we do in liberal Western societies, the institutionalization of secular law and then the freedom of religious law. Although I think there should be absolute religious freedom where, like, currently, the Amish are being gone after for education, as well as, like, I guess sexual harassment and stuff like that. So religious communities don't have total autonomy. They're not their own legal entities. So I think religious law would be an appropriate space for like the lowest level of nomological framework, and it's better than having a secular law only, like a mass libertarian society. So I guess separation of church and state, for the most part, I agree with in pragmatic terms, and I think it's the most healthy attitude to espouse now, being in the position that we are in. Ideally, would you want one religious law? Yes, but that's only when you have metaphysical science. Personally, this is the way I see the future of humanity potentially going, that we do develop metaphysical science, perhaps out of, digital physics, digital, idealism, and Chris Langen's system, among other component parts. We concretize a metaphysics with certainty. We solve the problems of epistemology, and arrive at a kind of universal law that is simply just the best for everybody. Like, if there was such a thing as a religious law that was a righteous and just law that was good for everyone, like the Jewish law purports to be, right? Like, why are you Jewish? Why do you follow the law? Because God laid down the law. It's God's law. It's the true law. And of course you should all follow it because God laid it down. God knows more than you. I mean, it's like paternalism in essence. Why do you do what your parents tell you when you're a kid? Because you're a kid, you don't know anything. Your parents know a lot more than you. And so ideally, if you were sure, if you could be sure that you had the right religious law, apply it globally, even tyrannically, because it's going to be best for people, ex hypothesi, right? If it's really a true law. But we don't have that certainty as of yet. And as far as developing our epistemology, I think we'll have to develop our epistemology in more and more collectivist terms, where we have to approach what Kurt Doolittle essentially wants, which is operationalization of language and propositions and like absolute decidability on propositions. And I think we can achieve that partly through AI research. AI is dangerous on the one hand, but it's also a proof of concept for systems of logic that logicians develop. It's a proof of concept for epistemological methods that empiricists and neuroscientists develop. Like work with neural networks can inform our epistemologies because it can inform the way we think about the way we acquire knowledge. Definitely recommend Jeff Hawkins' book on intelligence, and he did work with AI and neural networks, and that's part of the reason he was able to develop his framework for explaining how the neural cortex works. So we can develop robust epistemologies by making proofs of concept that our epistemological notions are sound. So instead of just like philosophically proving it, you can just build the damn thing and say, look, it gets the right answer. That appeals to me in a certain sense. It's also scary. It also seems to dehumanize. But ultimately, like, logic is not ours. Logic is ontological. And the closer we can get to that true logic, the closer I think we get to God. Now, the hazard is if we don't approach that true logic and approach AI in the spirit of experimentation, in a certain sense, like experimental science, Baconian science is satanic. That's the Faustian wager. Francis Bacon was Faust. And observational science has this greater degree of purity. The cat's out of the bag, genie's out of the bottle. So we have Faustian science, we have experimental science. What are we going to do with it? Are we going to continue in a left-hand path, Faustian vein, and experiment with AI in ways that we can't predict the outcomes of? And this would be like evolutionary algorithms and stuff like that, where we allow chance mutation to take over, essentially, in designing these systems, versus the other path, which would be, modeling our own thought process to a greater and greater degree, modeling our own epistemology philosophically to a greater degree, and this eventually leads us to a capacity for understanding ourselves, and also we get out of this potentially beneficial AI. And I know a lot of people don't believe in the AI thing, but most of the people who don't believe in it haven't read about it. There are a few people who are informed and still don't believe. I finally did get around to Roger Penrose's book on the topic, The Emperor's New Mind, and there are a few fallacies in the whole thing, insofar as he dismisses certain theories, like the many worlds interpretation, with just kind of a hand wave and a couple statements about it and assertions that certain things like don't make sense. Particularly, he targeted the many worlds interpretation in that way. And his rejection of existing interpretations of quantum dynamics often hinges on the many worlds interpretation being lumped in there. But if the many worlds works to solve some of these problems of interpretation, then his criticism is moot, and we don't need a new quantum theory to explain things. The existing one works, and that's what his whole idea is predicated on. That the brain is a quantum computer, and we don't understand quantum mechanics, and therefore we're way, way far away from building any kind of real AI. He also seemingly kind of just assumes that a real AI would have to be conscious. I don't think so. I think a modular, a network of specialist AIs that are themselves as unconscious as computer programs are currently, as long as it does the things it needs to do, and solves the problems that we give it and has the kind of motivational structures that we give it, in the sense that a heat-seeking missile has the motive of seeking heat. We can program in goals, we can program in methods, but if it has built-in evolutionary algorithms to seek out solutions that we haven't thought of yet, it can arrive at greater than human level intelligence in various ways. But then again, that is kind of the dangerous path that I don't want to go down. I think that's the temptation. That's going to be the easier path of AI development. And so as far as globalist projects, when you have people like Elon Musk and Max Tegmark and Bob Iger and people like that, like working seriously on putting together institutes for AI safety, that I kind of support that, right? And hopefully they go in the direction of like working with philosophers, working with logicians and philosophers of science to arrive at really robust epistemological models. And that's the kind of thing we need to have collective epistemology. And once you have that, I mean, in a sense, this is what groups are formed on the basis of: collective epistemologies, right? Christians work together because their source of knowledge, their source of information is the same. There's epistemological consensus. Therefore, they agree on the state of the world because their criteria for judging statements about the world is the same. They agree on what the world is. And if their epistemological praxis is the same in terms of moral propositions as well, then they agree on what ought to be done. And so the core of community building is really a shared epistemological perspective, shared standards of knowledge. And so AI actually can help us in that regard, in providing very demonstrable proofs of some epistemological methods over others. Charles Macaulay, have you checked out Bruce Charlton's blog? I've not. Okay, so let's see. Space-time. If you were omnipotent and omniscient, what would you make of reality and being? Well, it would be myself, right? Because if all power belongs to me and all knowledge belongs to me, what else is left? And how would I know myself in the best possible way? I would probably know myself not just from one centralized perspective, but from an infinite number of perspectives that recombine in an infinite number of ways. That would be the maximum possible kind of omniscience. And if that took place, if an infinite mind did that, you would have reality as it currently exists. Joe Howard, thanks for answering my question. Any interest in having another conversation with Kurt Doolittle? I know how you feel about him. I'll talk to Kurt. I've offered to debate him. I've challenged him, and I don't think he's going to talk to me. But Church of Entropy, fancy seeing you here. Okay, he's talking to somebody else and talking to somebody else. Charles Macaulay, thank you. And do you think any Atlantean bloodlines made it into European dynasties, Nazis? Yeah, for sure. And they're not, the whole question of the true origin of the European monarchies and certain kind of insurgent populations, that's, I think, widely known, right? Space-time, the blind Pharisee. Okay, he's talking to somebody else. This reminds me also, because I'm streaming, there is on DasBooks, and DasBook is in the chat. They're on DasBook's channel. There's a discussion between myself and DasBook on a few different topics. Global government, globalism, some points on like postmodernism versus my own beliefs, and Gandalf White 2. This is not a tough call. Airval. The only option for saving the West men and West women is scientific theocracy. Oh, yeah. That's exactly what I'm saying. just reading the chat. Gandalf White 2, no, AI is not based on a proper understanding of quantum mind. Your epistemology is completely wrong. Okay, well, a proper understanding of quantum mind. I'm willing to entertain the notion that the mind, or the brain rather, is a quantum computer. That doesn't rule out AI. That would just imply that to have an AI that works in the same way our minds work, you would have to have it running on a quantum computer. And so, like, we can't do that yet, but maybe one day. So I don't know what there's no real contention or critique there. And then Gandalf again, was Francis Bacon Faust, or does the Faustian myth have other meanings? Marlowe and Goethe tell the story completely differently. Ervol, you're too all over the place. Well, I'm responding to chat, so I don't have to take all this criticism. I'm tempted to... No, I won't ban people just for saying stuff like that. But if you have a disagreement, be fair and be explicit in your disagreement, because I don't like name calling and, these kind of sweeping generalizations. There are other interpretations of the Faust myth. The Faust myth applies in different contexts. There is the explicit deal with the devil aspect, but experimental science, Faustian, Baconian science is a deal with the devil in the sense that I think he was inspired in that path by the researches of John Dee in the occult, and by alchemical research, and by the influence of the Proto-Rosicrucians. And I'm inclined towards the idea that Bacon was involved in the rise of Rosicrucianism in Germany and things like that. There's a ton of Francis Bacon conspiracy theories you could get into. But Das Book, propositional reference and possible meanings are ongoing meaningful to the speaker, differently than the listener. A greater degree, yes, absolutely, or absolute, nah. All right. And Charles Macaulay, maybe coronavirus is a eugenic AI engineered virus. Yeah, I'm kind of leaning that way. Look at Joseph Farrell's latest News and Views from the Nefarium. I agree with, not that I've done a ton of research, but he points to some very interesting connections with a lab in Canada and some other stuff. It's looking like there's definitely something going on. And let's see. Gandalf, we need a unified field model for physics to take quantum mechanics to the next step beyond the Copenhagen thesis. Yeah, Penrose argues this, and I'm trying to remember exactly on what basis, and you're not providing it, you're just making an assertion, just to be clear here. Because we can't... there is relativistic quantum mechanics. There is special relativity, like spatial relativism applied to the Schrodinger equation and quantum dynamical processes, but I don't think certain implications of general relativity have been unified. And I'm not quite sure on all the details there why that is the case. Another point was how you can't explain the collapse under current theories, but I think the collapse is basically explained under many worlds in that there never is a true collapse. You're only viewing one slice, one aspect of the whole distribution. The whole distribution doesn't disappear, and the dynamics, the actual governing equations, are always those of mainstream quantum mechanics. We view the collapses as they occur based on our perspective. Under many worlds, and I think just dismisses many worlds unfairly in that book. I didn't read it, I listened to it, and it's super hard to listen to because there's a bunch of math in it, but I might buy that book at one point and try to actually get into the math itself. Gandalf, or Admiral Murat, thanks for loving on the big birds. Yeah, you guys seem like a bunch of good guys. Gandalf White 2, that's not a definition of omniscience, as infinity is not so clearly defined. Okay, I mean, unlimited knowledge, all knowledge. I think you can understand my meaning there, but if you want to ask like a clarifying question, that'd be fine. Basically, I find this kind of talk unhelpful. Like you're saying it's not a definition of omniscience because infinity isn't so clearly defined. Technically, that would apply to any definition whatsoever because all definitions simply appeal to other words, and within a definition, you never define all the other words in that definition. So, in other words, this criticism is like not saying anything specific about what I said. So I'm not impressed. Daspook, I consider Eric as spitballing this bit about his collective epistemology. Difference is inherent within focuses, manner, sentimentality, etc., unbeknownst to an AI, lest AI predicts our thoughts. Right. I'm not like saying we're going to get a God AI that emulates all aspects of consciousness anytime soon, or even if we ever will. But I am spitballing, so you're right. I'm kind of like theorizing on the fly here about certain things. Juan de la Lastra, the contradictory notion of being free and also being created. What is your take on determinism and free will and divine creation? I dealt with agency pertaining to temporal B theory earlier in the stream. You could go back and I think that would more or less answer your question. Gandalf, okay, I think I understand now. Appreciate you reading my questions. All right. Gandalf, I'm a polite person. I didn't mean to come across as attacking you. I'm just a very blunt, old-soul German. I just love getting into muck and mire of ideas. Okay, fair enough. I like arguing too. And I've always had an open, outstanding invitation to anyone who wants to debate any point that I adopt. Definitely contact me and you can come on my channel and debate it. Or at least we'll have it somewhere online. And I want to qualify that immediately because if you're not articulate and you can't really present your ideas cogently, then it's going to make for bad viewing. And so I don't mean that in the absolute widest sense, because I could get a literal like schizophrenic person coming in and saying totally crazy stuff, and I probably wouldn't put that on my channel. Septius 7, what about the Lost Civilizations idea? I heard they found the Younger Dryas meteoroid crater in Greenland. Yeah, that was like last year. So that's true. And I have one video on Graham Hancock's general hypothesis and his latest book, so I'm woke to that question. Gandalf, I agree with you regarding Bacon and him being tied to John Dee. Ben D, what's the best book for someone to read on perennialism? Would you suggest Huxley's book, The Perennial Philosophy? Yeah, because it's short. I know Huxley's a globalist and everything. I'm a globalist too. I think he was an enlightened Anglo-globalist who actually did want the best. I don't think he was evil. And The Perennial Philosophy doesn't contain any like really nefarious stuff. There's no dark perennialism in it. There is dark perennialism, the so-called left-hand path, and chaos magic, Aleister Crowley, all of that stuff would be involved there. That's a tradition you want to avoid. But Huxley's book is not totally on that side. I think it's an impartial, just kind of cataloging of typical perennialist views. But philosophically, I mean, if you can understand Platonism, it's hard to understand Platonism because it's not explicitly contained in the dialogues. You kind of have to infer the whole system. Then read Plato. I think Schopenhauer's system is helpful for understanding Plato as well, and helpful again for understanding perennialism. As far as like one book, yeah, read The Perennial Philosophy. And if you're like a philosophically minded person, then there's a bunch of other sources you can refer to. You can also just talk philosophy with me, and I'll explain whatever I can. Gandalf White 2. Not sure if Bacon's influence in Germany, though. I'll need to reread Dame Frances, or Dame? Frances Yates, who did a lot of good writing in the 1970s regarding Rosicrucianism. Yeah, I don't know about Francis Yates and his writings in particular on that, but so taking a little break right now just to talk about like collectivism versus individualism. To really create a collective, the thing to do is probably to take the Weberian route and have a charismatic figure who has a doctrine, a system of ideas that they push to those who receive it and never introduce any question. Like a philosopher is not the best person to create a collective. And honestly, like a really empathetic person is also not the best person. Like Jesus may be the exception if he's a true avatar, which I believe. But typically, a good leader is one who doesn't care about people and make time for people and like talk to the little guy. They're those who like retain exclusive cadres around themselves and like talk down to people. And just look at how Nick Fuentes acts. I don't like that unempathetic approach. I recognize that it's necessary pragmatically to build anything. And I'm hoping that Nick has a lot of the noble lie going on in his whole worldview and what he's promoting. I can see that he's still, I think, pushing towards the good, so I won't counter-signal him. But, like, I couldn't do that. I can't build a collective for that reason, but I can engineer dialectics, hopefully, and create good conversations that will have the effect of, A, priming people to receive those networks of ideas that are truly sound, and B, just increasing that kind of generation of new ideas. And I think we can probably kind of fall back on this kind of individual negotiation of interests in forming collectives that are really just economic cooperation, scholastic cooperation. There's a lot of cooperation we can do without this kind of Weberian charismatic figure, the prophetic figure laying down a law, and then the charismatic hierarchy emerging around that. There are other ways communities form as well. I think that has certain advantages. There are other forms of collectives that are, I don't know. I just have faith in like having love for all people and really wanting to seek the truth. I think that will lead to the good. And so this is my kind of just irrational belief that if I offer to talk philosophy with everyone, and if I just say explicitly what I believe, exactly what I believe, and it's not like I never leave anything out. There are a lot of things that I will never talk about on YouTube that I believe. But I'll talk to people about those things. But anyway, that's just related to this collective idea, because that's a strategy for building community that I don't know if it really works, except among existing elites, perhaps. Maybe there are certain think tank environments where that works. And for that to work, you really need to create that constellation of material interest, because attachment to ideas and inhabiting ephemeral online spaces is just not sufficient to keep idealistically motivated communities together today. In the past, if you had an idealistic motivated community, it also had that material component. Lacking that, it's just not going to stay together. I've seen projects come and go, and I'm going to keep working on my project. And again, I'll plug Peer Academy. If you're not involved, join the discussion group. We discuss topics like this and other things weekly. And the discussion this week will be 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time in my Discord. The link for that will be in the description after this video is up. It might be there now, I'm not sure. But just to plug that and take a little break. Hector Quinn, given the vast number of animals living in hellish conditions and killed each year, 60 billion land animals alone, don't you think this issue deserves more attention among moral people? Yeah, I do, right? Like, I'm not a vegan, I'm not a vegetarian because of my physical constitution. I'm just not. I've been vegetarian. I was vegetarian for a year, and I was vegan for 40 days, and I was just sick. I was getting sick trying to be a vegan. Being vegetarian, my energy just declined over the course of the year, and I agree with Schopenhauer, basically, that it is cruel what we do to animals, but our minds are, we put a lot more work into our lives and our minds than the animal does. And like technically it's wrong to squash a fly, right? You're hurting something. Ahimsa, don't harm. I believe in that. But if it's a case where squashing the fly will make like my daughter not afraid, if I will kill a bug if it will provide any degree of relief for someone I care about, because they're a human being with much greater intelligence than the animal and much greater capacity for suffering. I do agree with Schopenhauer again that the greater the intelligence, the more the sensitivity to suffering. And so humans are simply more valuable than animals because they can suffer more and they can experience more positive emotion, love, attachment, higher values, aesthetic appreciation. And so I think we should definitely try to get rid of factory farming. And that goes along with my whole like philosophy of how the earth should be divided up under some kind of distributivism. I think more people should be actually in contact with animals, and no factory farming, like pasture raised everything. That's the ideal. That's what I would like to push for. And like slaughter as mercifully as possible in a way that minimizes the pain. But I think in the grand calculation, if having animal nutrition helps certain people, and those people are important, especially if they're important in helping the world in a larger sense, then give the person who needs it that meat. If somebody is going to be an altruist in other ways and help the planet in other ways, and eating meat will help them do that even a little bit, let them do it. But probably not everyone should eat meat, right? And we should probably even be directing ourselves evolutionarily over generations to eat less and less meat. And we should also probably decline our population globally, not just Westerners, obviously. And I'm not preaching like antinatalism to our people at this time. Das Buch. Even though technically I am, as a perennialist, kind of an antinatalist, if you want to be really strict about it. I think not everyone should be an antinatalist, not everyone can, but that is the monastic ideal, and it's there in Christianity too, right? Paul says you should be celibate, but if you can't, have a wife. Jesus says the same thing. Das Buch, lol, I like Eric. I think it's funny when he gets slightly frustrated. The analog of the brain as a quantum computer is merely metaphoric. We can't come down on topics in the same way. No? Well, I don't know if it's a metaphor or not at this point. Hector Quinn, to be honest, human suffering pales in comparison if we are to quantify it. Yes, right, because there's a lot more suffering going on probably in animals on the whole under current conditions, which is why you want to get rid of factory farming as soon as possible. And I do care about animals, right? Gandalf White 2, I appreciate you. I didn't mean to come across as hostile in the slightest. You did a lot to help me get out of the proprietarian cult. Well, he said something else, but good. Yeah, I don't blame you. Das Buch, how does AI deal with the specter of a proposition? That is, deal with the specter within a human's head. The ghost in the machine? Is that what you're talking about? I don't know if we can get into this. I have to probably read the rest of these that are here and then get going because I have something coming up. Gandalf, well, I've been on Luke Ford quite a bit. I get a lot of positive reviews. You and I would have some interesting discussions. I appreciate your Peer Academy idea. Okay. Yeah, definitely. I mean, come on. Join the Discord and contact me through there. That's the best way. Spacetime, The Blind Pharisee, what music have you been listening to? I literally exclusively listen to Bach. I should listen to other stuff more often, honestly, but Bach is the best music. There's no arguing with that. Odie et Amo, the traditionalist school reject Huxley. Yeah, I don't care about the traditionalist school. And Evola was a dualist and kind of a pseudo-intellectual. Odi et Amo, read the world wisdom compilations. Odi et Amo, underlying religion, etc. Okay. I'm not a perennialist because there's some literary tradition. I'm a perennialist because I came to that philosophy based on physics and based on my own reason. So I took more of like an analytic approach into the position. I care about tradition now, and I have reasons for caring about tradition, but I don't care about the traditionalists or anybody who identifies in a literary sense as part of that movement. Not that they're all bad. I mean, there's value in all those writings. Space-time, how does metaphysics and musical composition intersect? I think contemporary music reflects contemporary metaphysics. And I think that's probably true. Schopenhauer viewed music as the only art that is a direct representation of the state of the will. And I've been thinking a lot lately about wave dynamics and how ultimately everything in physical reality can be described in terms of the interaction of waves. And so when Pythagoras describes the third level as harmonia, this is very telling. And in a sense, maybe acoustics is the foundational science in a way. Hector Quinn, Huxley wrote after the major traditionalists. Charles Macaulay, what are thoughts on Vox Day and his movement? I don't have any thoughts. Common Sense Philosophy, have you read much? Guénon, Schuon. I've barely looked at Guénon. Schuon, I think I listened to an interview. He didn't seem all that bright. I don't care about the literary aspect of perennialism or traditionalism. It's all right. I have other things I need to be reading. Hector Quinn, Nick has very immoral ideas and seems like a bitter person. He has no higher ideals beyond 1950s Americanism. No, he signals, he understands philosophical pessimism. He understands detachment. I think he understands where I'm coming from. And I think he recognizes that he has to have this persona in order to make the situation even somewhat better. And I fully support him if that's what he's doing. And I suspect that's what he's doing. Equinox, what are the best National Socialist books or authors that don't forward race realism? I don't know why you're asking me. Maybe someone else could answer that. Gandalf White, you and I should interact, Telegram, and we'll schedule a time to talk. Okay. I don't use Telegram, but you can join my Discord. Charles Macaulay, Ahriman is always one step ahead because we are always a pawn in his social media experiment. Ah, yes. Very true. I'm not going to get into solutions now. I have to leave soon, but I've put forward different stuff. Jonathan Kelly, do you think that masculine feminine is a manifestation of a deeper ontological dyad like Paras, Apollon, Yin Yang, or Purusha Prakriti? Yeah, 100%. Hector Quinn, no, Purusha Prakriti is the most explicit, and Yin Yang is masculine feminine too. Hector Quinn, no offense, dude, but your diet just wasn't well balanced. Maybe, hey. Unless you can define what macro and micronutrient plants are deficient in, the problem is what plants you're eating, not eating plants per se. I'm willing to entertain that possibility, but this just feeds back into the same issue I discussed before, where if eating meat helps me in my project, I'm going to eat meat because I think my project is important. I think I can make a difference in setting up a school. That's what I want to do. And if I spend a bunch of time like being neurotic about plant nutrition, that's less time I'm going to spend on other things. And I'm just not going to do it, man. I'm not going to feed my kids a plant-based diet if I don't understand the implications of that. It's like getting into the research and really knowing takes a huge amount of time. And that is time that I could spend trying to build towards my project. And like I said, I value that much more than even, more animals dying. I value animal life, but I think you have to have priorities here. Maldor, yes, the affirmation of the will is evil. Jonathan Kelly, and it is. It is. Continued, lately I've been entertaining the idea that male, female, and all the attributes associated with them are a complex of features not reducible to something ontologically simple. Well, they are as they manifest in the world, but the question is the source of the distinction. And the source is metaphysical, I think. Planky and Cathester. I wish Airvol could be at least a quarter as active on YouTube as Ken. Alas, I cannot. Archon Ilarion says hello. And Gandalf, again, what is your opinion of Rachmaninoff? Rachmaninoff is good. I think I like, actually, and this is an unpopular opinion, but I like Prokofiev more than Rachmaninoff. And to be honest, I personally enjoy Shostakovich more than either. Even though that's like the anti-traditional take. Anonymous, no name, zinc, and talking about plant diets. And Gandalf, yeah, Europeans compared to Asians and especially Africans should be consuming more meat, not less. Yeah, I am a big believer in that, and Taleb expresses this really well in Anti-Fragile. Like, you eat what your ancestors ate, because no matter how you develop a theory of nutrition, like the evolutionary process is going to be a more robust test of what's true and what's false rather than what you think or what you anecdotally observe. And so, yeah, I will try to eat more or less what my ancestors ate. Pizza accepted. Okay, so that's going to do it. And thanks, everybody, for watching. Please do join Pure Academy. Join the discussion list. Create an account on Pure Academy. Email me, or rather message me on the site. Tell me you want to be signed up for the list. After that, you'll get emails every Sunday with discussion pairs. You will know who your partner is. You schedule a time to discuss the topic with them, and then we have the group chat on Saturdays, usually this Saturday, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and that will be open to anybody, so you don't actually have to be signed up for Pure Academy to be in the group chat. Oh, and last, I actually did say that I would include at the end the topics for the poll, and so I guess I'll just evaluate it based on the most liked comment here for these topics, or whatever it just appears to be the one that wins out. But the topics are politics and ethics, individualism, that's what we're doing now, never mind, politics and ethics, the applicability of past political ideologies to our circumstance, the question of consciousness, is it emergent or fundamental? We will do the question of I didn't write these down. There's one other question that I've been wanting to talk about. Oh, natural rights. So out of those four, which one sounds good? And any other discussion you want to have it on the Discord. Thanks for watching.